In the spring of 2022, missiles struck Ukrainian cities, and the world watched in horror as one of the largest conflicts in modern European history began to unfold before global television screens. Investors around the world watched their screens as stocks fell and currencies lost their value fast as fear spread through every major financial market from London to Tokyo to New York City. Welcome to the Secret Treasury, where money, influence, and history intersect. Subscribe to trace the flow of power behind the headlines. Oil prices climbed past $100 per barrel for the first time in years, as Russian pipelines became the center of the most watched energy crisis since the 1970s Arab oil embargo. The Russian ruble collapsed on currency exchange screens around the world as Western governments announced wave after wave of financial sanctions targeting Russian banks and assets. Ordinary Russian citizens stood in long lines outside bank doors in Moscow, hoping to withdraw their savings before the value of their money fell even further overnight. The SWIFT banking network, the invisible system that moves money between countries every single day, cut Russian banks off from the global financial system in a matter of hours. That decision sent a signal to every government on earth. The financial system itself had become a weapon, and no country holding foreign reserves felt completely safe anymore. Inside the Kremlin, advisors stared at economic reports showing that Russia had lost access to nearly half of its $640 billion foreign reserve fund frozen in Western banks. In Beijing, government officials quietly ordered a review of how much of China foreign reserves sat inside Western financial institutions that could one day be frozen the same way. In Kyiv, Ukrainian government officials posted a crypto wallet address on a public government Twitter page and asked the world to send Bitcoin to help fund their national defense. Within 24 hours, millions of dollars worth of Bitcoin, Ethereum, and other digital assets flowed into Ukrainian government wallets from ordinary people in over 40 different countries. No bank approved the transfer. No government signed a permission form. No central authority reviewed the transaction. The money simply moved because the network allowed it to move. This was not a small moment. This was the first time in recorded history that a sovereign nation used decentralized digital currency to fund a real, active military defense effort. Bitcoin had been invented in 2008 by a person or group using the name Satoshi Nakamoto, who published a short paper describing a new kind of money no government could control. That paper arrived in October 2008, just weeks after Lehman Brothers Bank collapsed in New York City and triggered the worst global financial crisis the modern world had ever seen. Millions of people around the world lost their homes, their savings, and their jobs, while the banks that caused the crisis received trillions of dollars in government rescue funds. Satoshi Nakamoto watched all of this and embedded a message inside the very first Bitcoin block ever created. It read, "Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks." That message was a newspaper headline from January 3, 2009. It told the world exactly why Bitcoin existed. It was built as an alternative to a system that had just failed everyone. In the early days, Bitcoin had almost no value. A programmer named Laszlo Hanyecz made the first real-world Bitcoin purchase in May 2010, buying 2 pizzas for 10,000 Bitcoin. Those pizzas cost him what would later become hundreds of millions of dollars. That transaction is remembered every year on May 22nd, now called Bitcoin Pizza Day across the world. But in 2010, nobody was thinking about hundreds of millions. They were thinking about whether this strange internet money would survive its first year without falling apart completely. Bitcoin had no headquarters. It had no customer service line. It had no CEO sitting in a glass office in San Francisco. It was just code running on computers around the world. Governments did not know what to do with it. Regulators struggled to define it. Economists called it a toy. Bankers called it dangerous. And yet the network never stopped running. In 2011, a website called Silk Road opened on the dark web and began using Bitcoin as its payment system, drawing global law enforcement attention to digital currency for the first time. The Federal Bureau of Investigation shut Silk Road down in 2013 and arrested its founder in a public library in San Francisco, seizing thousands of Bitcoin in the process. Many financial commentators declared Bitcoin dead after the Silk Road shutdown. It had been declared dead dozens of times before. Each time the network simply kept producing blocks. The price of Bitcoin crashed from over $1,000 in late 2013 to under $200 in 2015. Billions of dollars in market value vanished from screens around the world. And yet miners in Iceland kept running their machines. Developers in Europe kept writing code. Believers in Asia kept holding their coins. The network never produced a single error. In 2014, the largest Bitcoin exchange in the world, a Tokyo-based platform called Mt. Gox, collapsed after hackers stole 850,000 Bitcoin from its digital vaults. The collapse of Mt. Gox destroyed the savings of thousands of people and gave governments around the world another reason to warn citizens about the dangers of digital currency. Japan launched a formal investigation. United States regulators held hearings. Newspapers ran headlines calling Bitcoin a fraud. The price dropped, then it recovered, then it rose. In 2017, Bitcoin crossed $10,000 for the first time. Television networks ran segments. Taxi drivers in New York City started asking passengers if they owned any Bitcoin. The United States Senate held hearings. The Chicago Mercantile Exchange launched Bitcoin futures contracts, officially bringing digital currency into the world of regulated financial markets. Then the price crashed again. From nearly $20,000 in December 2017, Bitcoin fell to under $4,000 by the end of 2018, erasing over 70% of its value in months. The headlines returned. Bitcoin is dead. Bitcoin is a bubble. Bitcoin is a scam. The same cycle repeated itself. The same network kept running without asking anyone for permission. What most people watching the price did not notice was what was happening underneath the price. Institutions were quietly studying the technology. Governments were writing regulations. In 2019, the United States Congress invited the founder of Facebook to testify about a proposed digital currency called Libra. Lawmakers grilled Mark Zuckerberg for hours on camera. The message from lawmakers inside that Washington, D.C. hearing room was clear. Digital currency was no longer something governments could afford to ignore or dismiss as a fringe idea. China watched the Libra hearings closely from Beijing. Within months, the Chinese government announced it was developing its own state-controlled digital currency called the digital yuan. The digital yuan was not Bitcoin. It was the opposite of Bitcoin. It was traceable, controllable, and issued by a central authority. But its existence confirmed something important. Even the most powerful, centrally controlled economy on Earth had concluded that digital currency was the future of money. The only question left was who would control that future. In March 2020, a global pandemic shut down cities from Milan to Mumbai. Stock markets crashed. Oil prices fell below zero for the first time in recorded history. The United States government authorized the printing of trillions of dollars in new money. The Federal Reserve cut interest rates to nearly zero. Central banks around the world followed. Economists debated what all this new money would mean for inflation. Ordinary people stared at empty supermarket shelves in cities from London to Los Angeles, wondering what came next. In October 2020, PayPal announced it would allow its 340 million users to buy, hold, and sell Bitcoin directly through its platform. The price of Bitcoin immediately jumped higher. In February 2021, a company called MicroStrategy held over 90,000 Bitcoin on its corporate balance sheet. Its chief executive, Michael Saylor, had publicly converted the company treasury. Tesla announced it had purchased $1.5 billion worth of Bitcoin and would accept it as payment for electric vehicles. Elon Musk tweeted a single Bitcoin symbol. Prices surged. Wall Street firms that had spent years warning clients about Bitcoin began publishing research reports recommending digital asset exposure as a hedge against inflation and currency risk. The same banks that once called Bitcoin worthless were now opening digital asset trading desks, hiring blockchain developers, and applying for crypto custody licenses from regulators. In November 2021, Bitcoin reached an all-time high of nearly $69,000 per coin. The total market value of all Bitcoin in existence crossed over $1 trillion for the first time. Then came 2022, and with 2022 came the war. Russian tanks crossed the Ukrainian border on February 24th, and every assumption the financial world had made about stability changed overnight. European energy markets went into crisis. German factories warned of shutdowns. French officials debated emergency rationing. The price of natural gas in Europe hit record levels. The United States dollar surged against almost every major currency on earth as investors around the world moved money into what they believed was the safest asset available to them. Bitcoin fell hard alongside stocks in the opening weeks of the war. Critics pointed at the falling price as a proof that Bitcoin had failed its promise of being a hedge against chaos. But something else was happening at the same time that the price charts did not show. Ukrainian civilians were crossing borders with nothing but a seed phrase memorized in their minds. A seed phrase is a string of 12 or 24 random words that gives complete access to a Bitcoin wallet. No physical item needed. No bank account required. No border guard could take it. Refugees fleeing Ukrainian cities carried their entire savings encoded in memory, crossing into Poland and Romania and Slovakia, and accessing their funds the moment they found internet. This was not theoretical. This was documented by journalists, aid workers, and researchers who interviewed displaced families in border towns and refugee centers across Eastern Europe. The United Nations and multiple humanitarian organizations began accepting Bitcoin and Ethereum donations for Ukraine relief efforts, converting digital assets into local currency for aid. Come Back, Alive, a Ukrainian non-profit focused on military equipment, had been accepting Bitcoin donations since 2014 following the first Russian incursion into eastern Ukrainian territory. By March 2022, that same organization had received millions in digital currency donations from supporters around the world who had no other way to send money directly into a conflict zone. Traditional wire transfers to Ukrainian bank accounts were delayed or blocked. International credit card networks suspended operations in Russia, but Bitcoin wallets kept receiving funds. The Ukrainian government digital wallet raised over $100 million in cryptocurrency within the first month of the conflict, a figure verified by blockchain analytics companies. Blockchain analytics firms like Elliptic and Chainalysis published public reports tracking exactly where those donations came from and how the funds were being converted into local currency. Simultaneously, Russian citizens trying to move money out of Russia turned to Bitcoin and other digital assets to preserve their savings as the ruble lost over 30% of its value. Peer-to-peer. Bitcoin trading volumes in Russia spiked in the days immediately following the sanctions announcement, according to data published by the blockchain research firm Chainalysis. This created a strange situation. The same asset was being used by Ukrainians to fund defense and by Russians to escape the economic consequences of the war their government had started. Bitcoin did not choose sides. It could not choose sides. That was the point Satoshi Nakamoto had built into its code 14 years earlier in a quiet message hidden inside a digital block. Western governments watched this dynamic with serious concern. A technology designed to resist censorship was resisting their sanctions just as effectively as it resisted any other control. The United States Treasury Department issued emergency guidance warning cryptocurrency exchanges to block Russian users from accessing digital asset services to enforce sanction compliance. Centralized exchanges like Coinbase and Binance complied with government orders and blocked Russian accounts. But decentralized networks had no central office where a letter could be sent. The European Union moved quickly to propose new regulations requiring digital asset service providers to report suspicious transactions and verify the identity of all their users completely. Regulatory bodies in the United Kingdom, Singapore, Japan, and Australia all issued updated guidance for digital asset companies operating within their national financial jurisdictions. The war had done what years of debate had failed to do. It forced every major government on earth to confront digital currency as a serious policy question, requiring immediate legal answers. In June 2022, El Salvador, the small Central American nation that had made Bitcoin legal tender in September 2021, faced intense criticism as Bitcoin price fell and its treasury showed losses. President Nayib Bukele of El Salvador had purchased Bitcoin for the national treasury, at prices significantly higher than where the market was trading in the middle of 2022. The International Monetary Fund warned El Salvador about the financial risks of holding Bitcoin as a national reserve asset and urged the government to reconsider its digital currency policy. But Bukele doubled down publicly on social media, posting updates about additional Bitcoin purchases and defending the long-term vision of making his country a digital asset destination. Meanwhile, in Miami, the city mayor, Francis Suarez, had announced plans to accept Bitcoin for city tax payments and pay city employees in Bitcoin, turning Miami into a digital currency showcase. The state of Wyoming in the United States passed laws recognizing digital asset property rights, attracting blockchain companies, and creating a legal framework other states began to study. In Texas, Bitcoin mining operations were growing rapidly, attracted by cheap energy, favorable regulations, and a state government openly welcoming to digital currency businesses. Large-scale Bitcoin mining facilities in West Texas began working with the state electrical grid to reduce power consumption during peak demand periods, acting as flexible load partners. This arrangement challenged one of the most common criticisms of Bitcoin, that it consumed too much energy without providing any benefit to the communities and grids that supported it. The University of Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance published detailed research tracking Bitcoin energy consumption and the growing percentage of that energy coming from renewable sources. The global conversation about Bitcoin had evolved dramatically. It was no longer just a question of whether digital currency was real. It was now a question of how to govern a real thing. By the end of 2022, Bitcoin had survived a global pandemic, a land war in Europe, the collapse of multiple major crypto companies, and regulatory pressure from dozens of governments. The price had fallen from its all-time high of nearly $69,000 to under $17,000. Billions of dollars in value had left the market, and the network had never once gone offline. That resilience was not an accident. It was not luck. It was the result of a design philosophy built by a personal group nobody had ever met, whose identity remained unknown to the world. The year 2023 opened with Bitcoin trading near its lowest point in 2 years, as investigators in New York City began building a criminal case against one of the most powerful figures in crypto. Sam Bankman-Fried, the founder of the FTX cryptocurrency exchange, sat in a Nassau, Bahamas courtroom in January 2023, facing charges that would ultimately result in a historic conviction. FTX had collapsed in November 2022 in a matter of days, erasing billions of dollars in customer funds and sending shockwaves through every corner of the global digital asset industry. Customers who had trusted FTX with their savings logged into their accounts and found withdrawal buttons that no longer worked, balances that had disappeared, and no explanation given. The collapse of FTX was not caused by Bitcoin failing. It was caused by a centralized company making decisions that no decentralized network could ever make on behalf of its users. Investigators found that FTX had moved customer deposits into a separate trading firm called Alameda Research, using other people's money to make high-risk bets in volatile financial markets. Congressional hearing rooms in Washington, D.C. filled with lawmakers demanding answers about how a company managing billions of dollars had operated with almost no regulatory oversight at all. Senator Sherrod Brown stood before cameras in a Senate Banking Committee room and called the collapse of FTX proof that digital assets required immediate and serious federal regulation. The Securities and Exchange Commission filed charges against Sam Bankman-Fried in December 2022, beginning one of the most watched financial fraud trials in American legal history. In October 2023, a Manhattan jury found Sam Bankman-Fried guilty on all 7 counts of fraud and conspiracy after deliberating for less than 5 hours in a crowded New York courtroom. Judge Lewis Kaplan sentenced him to 25 years in a federal prison, a sentence that sent a clear message to every financial operator in the digital asset space about legal accountability. But while the FTX trial dominated headlines, something quieter and more consequential was happening inside the offices of the largest asset management firms on Wall Street in New York. BlackRock, the firm that manages more money than any other institution on earth, filed an application with the Securities and Exchange Commission to launch a Bitcoin exchange-traded fund. A Bitcoin exchange-traded fund would allow ordinary investors to gain exposure to Bitcoin price movements through a regulated brokerage account without ever holding digital currency directly. BlackRock had over $9 trillion in assets under management. Its decision to file for a Bitcoin product was not speculation. It was a calculated institutional statement about digital assets. Fidelity Investments, Invesco, ARK Invest, and several other major financial firms filed similar applications within weeks, creating the largest wave of institutional Bitcoin interest ever recorded. The Securities and Exchange Commission had rejected every previous Bitcoin exchange-traded fund application for over a decade, citing concerns about market manipulation and investor protection. But this time felt different to market observers. The firms filing were not small startups. They were the bedrock institutions of the traditional American financial system seeking approval. In August 2023, a federal court in Washington, D.C. ruled that the Securities and Exchange Commission had acted arbitrarily in rejecting an earlier Bitcoin exchange traded fund application. That court ruling changed the legal landscape completely. The commission that had blocked every Bitcoin fund application for 10 years now faced a direct legal challenge to its authority. Lawyers and analysts watching the case from offices in Washington, D.C. and New York began publicly predicting that a Bitcoin exchange-traded fund approval was now a matter of when not if. On January 10, 2024, the Securities and Exchange Commission approved the first spot Bitcoin exchange-traded funds in United States history, ending a decade-long regulatory standoff. The following day, January 11, 2024, 11 Bitcoin exchange-traded funds began trading simultaneously on American stock exchanges, drawing billions of dollars in trading volume immediately. BlackRock Bitcoin Fund alone attracted over $1 billion in inflows on its first day of trading, a record for any exchange-traded fund launch in the history of American financial markets. Pension funds in the United States began reviewing their mandates to determine whether allocating a small percentage to Bitcoin through regulated funds fell within their fiduciary responsibilities. Financial advisors who had spent years telling clients to avoid digital currency entirely were now fielding questions about how to access Bitcoin funds through standard retirement accounts. The same financial establishment that had called Bitcoin a fraud for 15 years was now offering it as a product through the same regulated brokerage platforms used to buy government bonds. Bitcoin price crossed $50,000 in February 2024 for the first time since the 2021 peak, driven by institutional inflows and growing anticipation of the next major supply event. That supply event was called the halving. Every 4 years, the Bitcoin network automatically cuts in half the number of new coins awarded to miners who process transactions on the network. On April 19, 2024, the fourth Bitcoin halving occurred, reducing the daily supply of new Bitcoin from 900 coins per day to 450 coins per day in a change written into the original code. Satoshi Nakamoto had programmed this halving schedule into Bitcoin from the very beginning. It was a deliberate design choice to make Bitcoin scarce in a way that no human decision could alter. Previous halvings in 2012, 2016, and 2020 had each been followed by significant price increases over the following 12 to 18 months, though past performance carries no guarantee of future results. The 2024 halving occurred for the first time in Bitcoin history during a period when institutional exchange-traded funds were actively purchasing Bitcoin on behalf of millions of new investors. Analysts at major banks including JP Morgan Chase and Goldman Sachs published detailed research reports examining how reduced supply combined with growing institutional demand might affect markets. Meanwhile, in El Salvador, something remarkable had begun to emerge from the controversial national Bitcoin experiment that international observers had largely written off as a political failure. Tourism to El Salvador increased significantly in 2023 and 2024 as digital asset enthusiasts from North America and Europe traveled to experience the first country with Bitcoin as legal tender. The small coastal town of El Zonte, known as Bitcoin Beach, had operated a community Bitcoin economy since 2019 and became a documented case study for economists studying digital currency adoption. Researchers from universities in the United States and Europe traveled to El Zonte and published academic papers documenting how residents used Bitcoin wallets on mobile phones for daily commerce. The International Monetary Fund, which had warned El Salvador about Bitcoin risks, began publishing more nuanced research acknowledging both the challenges and documented benefits of the experiment. In March 2024, El Salvador reported that its tourism revenue had increased substantially, and that the country had achieved its first budget surplus in over 2 decades of fiscal records. Economists debated how much of that improvement came directly from Bitcoin adoption and how much came from other government policies, but the conversation itself had shifted considerably. Other small nations began studying the El Salvador model carefully. The Central African Republic had declared Bitcoin legal tender in 2022 but faced infrastructure challenges that slowed adoption. In the Pacific island nation of Tonga, a member of parliament publicly proposed that Tonga adopt Bitcoin as legal tender, citing remittance costs that consumed a large share of household income. Remittances, money sent home by workers living abroad, represented some of the most expensive financial transfers in the global economy, with fees often reaching 10% of the total amount. A worker in Los Angeles sending money to family members in the Philippines or Guatemala or Nigeria could use Bitcoin to transfer value in minutes at a fraction of traditional wire transfer costs. The World Bank published data showing that remittance fees averaged over 6% globally, costing migrant workers tens of billions of dollars every year in transaction charges alone. Bitcoin Lightning Network, a technology layer built on top of the main Bitcoin network, allowed near instant transfers of tiny amounts at cost measured in fractions of a single cent. Strike, a payments company using the Bitcoin Lightning Network, launched in multiple African countries in 2023, offering local workers a way to receive international payments without bank accounts. In Nigeria, where the local currency had lost significant value against the dollar and banking access remained limited for millions of citizens, digital currency adoption grew rapidly through 2023. The Nigerian central bank had actually banned banks from processing cryptocurrency transactions in 2021, but peer-to-peer trading volumes in Nigeria continued to grow despite the restriction. In 2023, Nigeria ranked among the highest countries in the world for peer-to-peer Bitcoin trading volume, according to data published by blockchain analytics firm Chainalysis in its annual report. The Nigerian government eventually reversed its banking ban in December 2023, acknowledging that the restriction had failed to stop adoption and had only pushed activity into less visible channels. Across the African continent, from Kenya to South Africa to Ghana, mobile phone-based digital currency applications were reaching populations that traditional banking infrastructure had never served. This was the story beneath the price charts that most financial media coverage consistently missed. Bitcoin was not just an investment asset, it was functioning infrastructure for the excluded. Back in the United States, the presidential election of 2024 brought digital currency into the center of political debate in a way that no previous American election had ever experienced before. Both major political parties held events focused specifically on digital asset policy. Candidates accepted cryptocurrency donations. Digital asset executives hosted fundraising events in Washington, D.C. Former President Donald Trump attended a Bitcoin conference in Nashville, Tennessee in July 2024 and made several public statements signaling support for the American digital asset industry. The Democratic Party platform also included language about creating clear regulatory frameworks for digital assets, reflecting how mainstream the policy conversation had become across both parties. In November 2024, following the election results, Bitcoin price surged past its previous all-time high and crossed $80,000 as markets responded to anticipated regulatory policy changes. By December 2024, Bitcoin crossed $100,000 per coin for the first time in its history, a price level that many early believers had predicted and many critics had called impossible. The total market capitalization of Bitcoin exceeded $2 trillion, placing it among the largest financial assets on Earth alongside gold, major stock indices, and government bond markets. Michael Saylor, whose company MicroStrategy held the largest corporate Bitcoin treasury in the world, appeared on financial television networks that had once dismissed Bitcoin as irrelevant. The same Bloomberg terminals and Reuters screens that once ran headlines calling Bitcoin dead now displayed Bitcoin price data alongside oil futures, gold spot prices, and currency exchange rates, Central banks around the world accelerated their research into central bank digital currencies, studying how programmable money might transform monetary policy and government payment systems. The Bank for International Settlements, which coordinates policy between the world's central banks, published extensive research on digital currency risks and opportunities for monetary authorities. China continued rolling out the digital yuan through pilot programs in major cities, processing billions of dollars in transactions through government-sponsored digital wallets on mobile phones. The European Central Bank advanced its digital euro project through consultation phases, studying how a programmable European currency might function alongside existing payment infrastructure. Every major economy on Earth was now actively engaged in some form of digital currency development, regulation, or adoption. The question was no longer whether digital money was real. The question that governments, central banks, corporations, and ordinary citizens were all now asking was the same question Satoshi Nakamoto had posed in 2008 inside a 9-page document. Who should control money? Should it be governments? Should it be banks? Should it be algorithms written by anonymous coders and enforced by mathematics rather than institutions and laws? That question had no simple answer. But the fact that every nation on Earth was now asking it represented one of the most significant shifts in the history of human financial organization. Bitcoin had survived 14 years of predictions about its death. It had survived exchange collapses, government bans, price crashes, regulatory crackdowns, fraud scandals, and a global war. It had been used by refugees crossing borders with nothing. It had been used by governments funding national defense. It had been sold by the largest financial institutions in human history. A pizza, bought for 10,000 Bitcoin in 2010, had become a symbol not of foolishness, but of the impossible becoming ordinary, of a radical idea, outlasting every effort to dismiss or destroy it. The war in Ukraine had shown the world something that no economics textbook had ever described. A borderless financial network could function as humanitarian infrastructure during active conflict. Donors in Tokyo sent funds to families in Kharkiv. Supporters in Toronto sent resources to volunteers in Lviv. The money moved without banks, without borders, and without asking permission. At the same time, that same borderless quality made Bitcoin resistant to the sanctions that democracies use as tools of international pressure against governments that violate human rights. This tension between financial freedom and financial accountability, between individual sovereignty and collective governance, was not going to be resolved by any single law or court ruling. It was the central financial tension of the 21st century, and Bitcoin had placed it at the center of global policy debate, whether governments wanted to engage with it or not. The story of Bitcoin was not really a story about technology. It was a story about trust, about who people trust with their money, and why that trust shifts when institutions repeatedly fail. In 2008, the banks failed, and a new idea was born in a 9-page document. In 2022, the borders closed, and that idea crossed them invisibly. In 2024, the institutions came to join it. The arc of that story stretched from a financial crisis in New York City to a war in Eastern Europe to a small beach town in El Salvador, to the floors of the largest exchanges on Earth. It stretched from a programmer buying pizza with internet tokens to a sovereign nation defending itself with digital wallets to pension funds allocating capital through regulated financial products. Every step of that journey had been declared the final chapter by someone. Every crash had been called the end. Every scandal had been called the proof that the whole thing was worthless. And yet the blocks kept coming. Every 10 minutes on average, somewhere on Earth, a new block was added to the Bitcoin blockchain, recording transactions and maintaining the chain of history. That rhythm, 10 minutes, another block, 10 minutes, another block, had continued without interruption since January 3rd, 2009, through every crisis, every crash, and every declaration of death. History does not move in straight lines. It moves through crises and corrections, through moments of failure that force new ideas into existence and new ideas that outlast the old systems. Bitcoin was one of those ideas. Whether it becomes the foundation of a new financial system or a permanent alternative operating alongside existing institutions, only time will fully reveal. What history has already recorded is that a borderless financial network, born from crisis, survived the war, changed the continent, and forced every government on Earth to reconsider everything. If this story moved you, hit subscribe button. The past holds powerful lessons, and I will help you uncover them.